Hello, everybody. A couple of months ago, we did a show with a very distinguished Harvard historian, Joyce Chaplin, on how a certain Benjamin Franklin warmed up America. Chaplin's new book, The Franklin Stove, An Unintended American Revolution, is an affectionate, if not entirely uncritical take on Benjamin Franklin, acknowledges his remarkably innovative career in terms of the invention of the so-called Franklin stove, this unintended American revolution. Benjamin Franklin, of course, is one of the founding fathers of the United States and one of the great Americans. According to our guest today, Franklin is indeed the greatest American. The new book, The Greatest American, Benjamin Franklin, History's Most Versatile Genius, is authored by Mark Skousen, who is joining us from Santa Ana. Mark, what are you, the eighth generation Franklin? Should one take your arguments seriously, given that Franklin's in your family?
I think there's a little prejudice there in calling him the greatest American. I'm not the only one who has done so, but I am a little bit, I'm not quite as objective as maybe a historian would be that typically writes objectively the pros and cons, although I do have a chapter in my book about Ben Franklin and his critics, and I don't defend Ben Franklin in every case. He was like any other human being. He had his mistakes and so forth, but he was very good at correcting his errata, as he says. Yeah, I'm the sixth generation grandson of Benjamin Franklin. I have not inherited much from Franklin. We're both left-handed. We could leave it at that. I do try to create a little humor. I have portrayed Benjamin Franklin. I've dressed up as Franklin from time to time, and I have a lot of fun with that. So it is a fun thing, and I'm a member of the Franklin group that meets every 5 years, celebrating our great ancestor. I'll be speaking next year at the Franklin reunion, the family reunion, about my book, and who knows, I may even appear as Ben Franklin.
Well, you look a little bit like him.
Yeah, I have. My mother actually looked more like him than I do, to be honest with you.
Your mother is. I assume your mother isn't around anymore, and you wouldn't have said that while she was alive, would you?
When I told her that, she was deeply offended that she looked like a man, but she has the structure and she has the nose.
Although the other argument might be that Benjamin Franklin looked like a woman, which is also a credible argument, I guess. He had long hair, although
he was definitely very masculine and very heterosexual.
Very what?
Heterosexual.
You mean he liked the ladies?
Oh, yes. He was the ladies' man. Far more than any other founding father, I believe.
Even more than a certain Thomas Jefferson, who certainly liked the ladies and was rather controversial for it?
Well, that's a good point. I think they would have something in common there for sure. But there's a lot of. I have a whole chapter on individuals on Franklin's views regarding Thomas Jefferson. He got along very well, but they disagreed very strongly. Jefferson liked the agricultural, the agrarian society. He was against the banks. He was against paper money. Franklin was all in favor of paper money. He was in favor of Hamilton's
so he was bank. He was more on the Hamiltonian side.
Very much so, and also Franklin liked big cities. So.
Right, Mark. In our conversation with Joyce Chaplin, I assume you've seen her book, The Franklin Stove.
Well, I have not, but I know who Joyce Chaplin is, and I actually did ask her to write a blurb for my book, and she never responded. Maybe she didn't get my email. I don't know.
Maybe she doesn't agree with you that Benjamin Franklin is the greatest American. In fact, in our conversation, she talked a little bit about Franklin and slavery. Of course, Jefferson was a notorious slave owner and had some concubines. What's your take on Franklin and the slave question?
Franklin owned slaves, not very many, certainly not the
Well,
number.
that's not much of an excuse if he didn't own many, is it?
Yeah, I think it is. He was not beholden to a slave economy. And in fact, at one point, he let his slaves go because he felt that slavery, he had a transformation. I have a chapter on this in The Greatest American. One thing I like about Franklin is he willing to change his mind. And he owned slaves, then he disavowed slavery. And at the end of his life, he was the first president of the Pennsylvania Society to abolish slavery and introduce legislation in Congress to end slavery once and for all. You have to give him credit for that.
Are there any blemishes on Franklin? As I said, I mean, you made it clear at the beginning that you're not the most objective of people because he's in the family. But what's the most effective critique of Franklin?
Well, a lot of people feel that he took advantage of his position, that he got his, nepotism was a big issue where he got his son William as the governor of New Jersey, and his other children were very much involved in going to France and participating in all of these things. He was constantly he got his son-in-law, who became the postmaster general, took his place in Pennsylvania. So nepotism was one of the issues. He actually held a grudge against his son William at the end of his life and never did reconcile. Some people say that he abandoned his wife Deborah, but it was really a combination. Deborah abandoned him when he wanted to go over to London. She refused to go on the high seas. So one could argue that she abandoned him, and other historians like Bill H.W. Brands feels that he didn't treat his wife properly and stuff. So there's definitely some criticism that can be made. And I have a whole chapter on those criticisms, and some of them are very legitimate.
He was, as you noted, a remarkably international fellow. In fact, the BBC just ran a piece about him as the U.S. founding father who traveled the globe. There's a famous Benjamin Franklin house in London where he lived. Could one even argue, Mark, that he was an American? Should we think of him as an Anglo-American or even an Englishman who happened to live in America?
Yeah, actually, H.W. Brands, Bill Brands from the University of Austin, has written a book called The First American. So he's not only the first scientific American, but he's also the first American who, some people have argued that Franklin is the one responsible for creating the view of an American and not just a colonist, a British colonist. They had a different language, and they're just, they were considered cruder than the British, so forth. There was that kind of attitude. But one thing that I must say about Franklin, that he was much more globally oriented. He loved the big cities. Philadelphia was a tiny town compared to the 1 million people that were living in London. He loved London. He was often, actually, some people thought he was a spy for the British during the American Revolution. Yes, he lived there on Craven Street for many years. I've been to the location a number of times. He loved the French people. The French loved him. In fact, he was the only American commissioner who really liked the French. All the other commissioners, John Adams and the Lees and so forth, Ralph Ichard, they hated the French. Franklin got along with the French, and in fact, he was the only American commissioner, ambassador to raised all the money that the French used to help defeat the British in the American Revolution. A lot of people think without French support, the Americans would have lost that war.
So maybe we should think of him, maybe not as the first American, but as the last Englishman. Where was he born? Tell us his brief story.
I was born in Boston, one of 10 children, and
from a good family, Mark.
Well, the parents were the father Josiah was actually had one wife and then another wife and had 17 children altogether, and so he was the 10th child of the second wife, I believe, and he worked with his older brother James and as a publisher. And then at 17, he ran away because he wasn't comfortable working under James's authoritarian attitude. And he ended up in Philadelphia, where he made his mark and became rags to riches, wealthy person as a printer, as a publisher of the Pennsylvania Gazette. He retired at age 42 as a wealthy man, and then he spent the rest of his life doing civic duties, as well as becoming a representative of the colonies politically in London as a colonial agent, and then as a representative of Congress representing Pennsylvania for the Declaration of Independence. He became the first ambassador, went to France, and there raised funds and arms to fight the British, and spent 8 years in Britain, and then returned and became the Continental Congress, the Constitutional Convention. So that was his last act. He was actually 84 years of age. He was a whole generation older than any of the other delegates to Congress at the time.
And then wasn't he responsible for perhaps the most remarkable comment after that convention when he talked about the Republic?
Well, yes, an older lady came up to him after the Continental, after they had signed the Constitution of the United States, and she asked, well, what kind of government do we have, Dr. Franklin? And he said, a republic if you can keep it. And as a matter of fact, one of the things he warned about, was very concerned, is that eventually we'd return to a monarchy and a king would rule over us. Certainly very applicable in today's world, where presidents are not going through Congress but signing executive orders. He would be totally against that.
Yeah, and I don't suppose he would think highly of presidents either who want to become popes.
Not only that, but Franklin was very influenced. In fact, they were influenced each other. Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, and Franklin became a free trader, and at one point said, a virtuous and industrious people may be cheaply governed. And he said, no nation is ever ruined by trade. And that's a very different point of view than our current president.
Yeah, I don't want to turn this into another Trump conversation, but perhaps we'll come to that later. That comment was presumably off the cuff after the convention. Was he a quick thinker? I mean, was there an 18th century English quality to his conversation? Did everything that come out of his mouth, could it be quoted, or was that just a one-off?
Well, he was actually reluctant to speak. He was quite silent during the Continental Congress regarding the Declaration of Independence. He only made one or two changes when Jefferson asked him to purview the Declaration of Independence. He made a very significant change that we're quite famous with. We hold these truths to be, what's the word?
Self-evident.
Jefferson actually said sacred and undeniable. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. Franklin, in his left hand, scratched out the words sacred and undeniable and put in self-evident.
Yeah, it's ironical that Jefferson, who wasn't much a believer, would have put in sacred, whereas the scientists would have put in self-evident. You mentioned John Adams earlier. I know that there wasn't a lot of love lost between Franklin and Adams. Adams struggled over the issue of independence. Did Franklin? I mean, at what point in his life did he recognize that independence was necessary and perhaps inevitable? Did he regret this?
One of the things that I did that a lot of people are unaware of is that my wife and I completed Franklin's autobiography, which ended in 1757. So there's really very little about any discussion of the American Revolution or his ambassador to France or the Constitutional Convention. That as early as 1771, he thought disunion was inevitable. However, he fought that for a long period of time. It wasn't until 1775 when he was kicked out of London and had to return. Otherwise, he would have been arrested, that he became a full-fledged advocate for independence and was very much supportive and encouraged the common sense pamphlet that became the kind of the spark plug for the revolution in 1776. So by then he had completely changed his mind. And of course, the problem with his son William is that William remained a loyalist, and so they had bitter fights over that very issue.
You mentioned Thomas Paine or his pamphlet.
A British citizen, by the way.
Where would you position Franklin politically? Conservative, liberal, leftist? I mean, it seems like there were moments in his life when he was all of those.
So Franklin is a unique character in that respect, and it's really hard to pinpoint him into any particular kind of label. He did say a virtuous and industrious people may be cheaply governed. Do we have cheap government today? As a impersonator of Ben Franklin, I have spoken to many different groups who are both Republicans and Democrats, and they all love Franklin. It's a really interesting phenomenon where nobody puts him into one or particular category. The other quote that Franklin is famous for, or at least I discovered in completing his autobiography, is his attitude toward foreign policy. He said, "The system of America is commerce with all and war with none." I mean, is there anyone who could disagree with that as an idealistic?
So why did John Adams hate him so much?
Well, for one thing, Franklin was not a Puritan. Adams was a devout churchgoer, and Franklin did not go to church on Sunday. He was a bit of a heretic, as Adams and others criticized him for. He had his own liturgy. He did believe in God, but he questioned whether Christ was the savior of the world. Plus, Adams, John Adams and his wife Abigail thought he was a renegade in terms of the sexual revolution. His attitude toward women, the fact that he had an illegitimate child, that he had a son who was a loyalist. There's just a lot of factors where Adams, who disliked the French, here he was made ambassador or commissioner along with Franklin to France, and yet he despised the French, and as a result couldn't raise any money. So he resented Franklin's ability to raise money. He didn't like the way he was with his attitudes toward women, being a ladies' man, a womanizer is what they would have referred to.
Yeah, I mean, maybe when John Adams was in church on a Sunday afternoon or morning, whenever they go to church, Benjamin Franklin was with one of his girlfriends.
He actually talks about his spending time with Madame Brionne and Elissus and other women, and spending time with them sometimes when their husbands were away. But there's no evidence. I mean, even though he's a widower at this time, there's no evidence that he was that sexually active. He just loved to flirt. He loved to spend time with women and go to the theater together and play chess together. He was really a ladies' man, and it's really fascinating to. I have a whole chapter in the completed autobiography called An Ambassador's Life, and it's all about his relationship with other women who would have these salons in France and would invite men and women to come and discuss political and economic and scientific pursuits. And don't forget that Franklin was the most famous American at this time, far more famous than George Washington or John Adams because of his scientific breakthroughs.
Yeah, his inventions and his wealth. Maybe we should rename the book, Mark, The Most Lovable American.
Well, at the end, actually, that would be true today. It wasn't true when he died. When he died, he had 20,000 people show up for his funeral, but he was not honored in the Senate, which was controlled by John Adams and others, the Lees, and they took a whole year before they honored him. He became more beloved after his.
Yeah, although Americans tend to sometimes not recognize the greatest Americans. There was a French film called The Man Who Loved Women, which began with his funeral, which was dominated by his female friends. I'm guessing that of all the thousands that showed up for Franklin's funeral, a lot of them were female, weren't they?
Yeah, there's no question about it. They were devoted to him in so many ways. You can see this in the letters that they wrote to Franklin. Franklin's French wasn't particularly good, but it didn't bother the French women at all. They were interested. Although Madame Helvétius was a widow herself, and Franklin asked for her hand in marriage, and she turned him down. But they still had this wonderful affection, and they were very sad when he finally left Paris and went back to the United States. There was quite a longing, a long farewell, that's for sure.
Yeah, I don't know what that would translate into French. Just as John Adams loathed Franklin, one of his great admirers was George Washington. I wonder if one reason for that, Mark, was that, like Washington, Franklin was very much committed to public service. As you noted, he spent the first half of his life making a great fortune, and the second half committed to the public good in the United States, perhaps in that sense like Carnegie or even Bill Gates. Is one of the reasons why, in your mind, he's the greatest American is because he's one of the founders of the promise and ideal of public service?
He's the ideal capitalist, American capitalist. This is what Jack.
With a conscience, though, not just. He's not Elon Musk. He's Bill Gates, isn't he?
Yes, in the sense that he devoted his time to civic affairs. He started the first hospital, the first library. He tried to get the roads to improve and the lighting there. He established the University of Pennsylvania. His inventions, the Franklin stove that Joyce Chaplin talks about, very important. He warmed the homes of their homes, and then he protected it from the lightning with the lightning rod. I mean, there were so many things that he did that were beneficial to the community. He started the first junto, this first Rotary Club, if you will. And I mean, he did so many things that were very much involved rather than just a Uncle Scrooge or Ebenezer Scrooge that would just have his pile of money and collect it and so forth. So he became a model citizen in so many ways. And this is why Jack Bogle of the Vanguard Group called him America's greatest capitalist, because he set the right standard that you don't just make the money and build a big mansion, but you use that money for public good.
So there is a moral quality to this. You hold the chair, the Doty Spogley chair in free enterprise at Chapman University. You're a unabashed libertarian, but you do seem to be suggesting that as a model, Franklin offers a moral case for greatness. It wasn't just that he amassed a great fortune or he was a remarkable innovator, which is true, but the third leg of that is in giving back. Is that your argument?
Absolutely. I think there is. I think he was definitely affected by, even though he was a skeptic regarding religion, he developed a desire to engage in charity and good works. He complained about all of the preachers who would preach a sermon and just go to church and devote themselves to worship their God. But how about the good works, about what you do in the other 6 days of the week? That seemed to be his focus. And he would, by the way, he was also very generous to all the different religions in Philadelphia. And he would be very, there's a lot of discussion of this in the original autobiography about his relationships and how he really worked on charity and good works as the true sign of a good Christian.
So, as I said, you're a noted libertarian. I think you're the founder of Freedom Fest, which is coming up. You've got one coming up in Palm Springs, which is very interesting. Celebration of libertarianism, includes keynote speakers like Ryan Holiday, an old friend of mine, Peter Schiff, Steve Forbes. But he would have been critical, wouldn't he, Benjamin Franklin, of 20th century iconic libertarians like Ayn Rand, who seemed to take an almost amoral Nietzschean position towards one's responsibility as a human being.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I would argue the same. I've had several debates with Jorn Brook and other members of the Ayn Rand Institute to say that selfishness is a virtue, greed is a virtue. No. Franklin and I and other Christian libertarians, if you will, reject that approach and emphasize the need to look beyond yourself, that your obligation is to love yourself, love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with self-interest. Certainly, Adam Smith and others advocated self-interest, and so did Ben Franklin. But it's once you have established a success and you look after your own self-interest, you have to start looking at the interest of others. So that is definitely Benjamin Franklin's perspective, and it's mine as well as a active Christian. I believe it's really important to be involved in the community and be involved in charitable works, and not just focus on, where I had this argument with the Ayn Rand people. I said, when the hurricane hits and the hurricane, who's out there to help people clean up and so forth? Is the Ayn Rand Institute gathering together a whole bunch of people to go out and help? And the answer is no, but Christian groups, Catholics, Mormons, others, we're all out there to help each other, to work with the government. We don't depend on the government to do this. And we need to help each other. So it's really important. Now, their response was, yes, but we create businesses and we create jobs, and that's how we help America. And that's a good point. But there's room for everybody, not just creating jobs, but also helping out those who are less fortunate.
You noted that someone had described Franklin as the last Englishman. The more you talk about him, I wonder, Mark, whether you might describe him more as a conservative, a Burkean conservative, than a libertarian. And the irony, of course, he was forced into the position of being a revolutionary, which probably didn't come very naturally. What would Franklin's opinion have been of Burke's ideas on government?
Edmund Burke was contemporary. I don't know to what extent they corresponded and so forth, but he would certainly have some sympathy. He actually criticized his daughter one time for asking for new gowns and stuff. Could you please send me the latest clothing that is popular in England? He actually criticized her for that. So there's an element of conservatism there as well. But at the same time, he was a member of the Hellfires, or not a member, but he attended the Hellfires Club in London, which I'm sure you know about, where it was rather salacious activities and stuff like that. So there's a libertine streak to Franklin, where he sought out low women. He complained about that. That was his errata.
Yeah, that's why Joyce Chaplin wasn't his biggest fan. I think he would have.
I would also add, Andrew, his issue on inflation is really interesting, because libertarians really criticize Franklin for being pro-paper money and actually in favor of inflation. And you can actually find some great quotes from Franklin who said, "Oh, you don't want to pay your taxes? Okay, we'll make sure you pay your taxes. We're going to depreciate the currency, so everybody has to pay their fair share." And he talks a little bit about this, but then, of course, he says we went too far with the inflation, with the Continental, and we had too much inflation, and that's not good either. So I don't think you can pigeonhole him in a particular point of view. It just depended on the situation. And you have to give him credit for trying to, he was into best solutions, not what your label is. It's not who is right, but what is right is Ben Franklin's attitude.
He was a practical man rather than ideologist. As you said, he changed his mind many times, which distinguished him. He died in April 1790, a year after the French Revolution. I would have guessed, and you're the Franklin expert and the relative, Mark, that he would have been horrified with the French Revolution, probably less with its beginnings than its middle bloody Robespierrean interlude. But what did he and what would he have thought of the French Revolution? He wasn't a natural revolutionary. Is that fair?
He certainly did have that conservatism, that this was kind of the last resort type of thing. At one point, he said there's never a good war or a bad peace. And he just hated war and the destruction. I think he was Burkean in the sense that he would like a traditional conservative approach. So you could spend time with scientific pursuits. One thing that he really regretted about the American Revolution is that it cut off his friendship with all of the British scientists that he had befriended over these years. So he hated war in that respect. He had great sympathy with the French and their wanting to make changes, and so was Jefferson. Both of them initially were very positive about what they were seeing at the beginning with the creation of the National Assembly and bringing back democracy and stuff like that, and maybe some of the Catholic Church being excessively powerful in France. I think there was a lot of sympathy there, but he died before the guillotine and all of the excesses of the French Revolution, which I'm sure he, as well as Jefferson, would deeply disturbed by. And there is one letter where he writes some of his French friends, and he says, "I'm hearing bad things about what's going on in France." And then, of course, he died before the full force of the French Revolution. It ended very badly compared to the American Revolution. And of course, one of the reasons is that the French hyperinflated much more than the Americans did. And they made the mistake of rather than taxing the Catholic Church, which is what the French should have done, they confiscated the property, so they lost any chance of earning any income at all. Just French made one serious mistake after the other.
Even the other revolutionaries, they weren't the best capitalists. That's why I brought up Burke. I think, like Burke, your friend and relative Benjamin Franklin would have been certainly horrified by Robespierre and the French Revolution.
Oh, yeah.
Mark, you yourself are, you mentioned the Mormons earlier. You yourself are a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints. We've done some shows on them. The most authentic and perhaps American of all religions or even communities. Do you think if I know this is a hard question to ask, but do you think, not to ask, but to answer, do you think if Franklin was around today, he might be a little tempted to join the church? I don't know how you ended up in it.
I was born in the church, that's for sure. But every person has to test their own faith. And a lot of people leave our church as well as other churches to move on. I think 40% of people who were born in a particular religion change their religion, lifetime at least, among Americans. I do have a really interesting chapter in The Greatest American, and that's a chapter called Claimed by the Masons and the Mormons. Franklin was a Mason. He reached to the highest level of Masonry. And of course, the Mormon faith and the Mormon temple has a lot of similarities to the Masonic ceremonies. So there is this story where Franklin, along with the founding fathers, appeared to Wilford Woodruff, who later became president of the church, in the St. George Temple. And they're asking, why don't you do these ordinances for us? We founded your country. We founded the nation of America. We never moved away from that. We never denounced it. And so can you do these ordinances for him? And so that's a very unusual chapter to suggest that you had somebody like Benjamin Franklin and George Washington and others having an interest in Mormon church temple ordinances.
And I wonder whether Franklin might have rather liked the polygamy in the original Mormon church, given his lifestyle.
I tell you, when his wife and the two separated, when he went over to London to be the colonial agent for 4 or 5 different colonies, he stayed with Mrs. Stevenson at this Craven Street house, and she had a daughter, and she was a widow, and that was an interesting experience. There are some historians who think that they had a relationship. No, we don't really know for sure, but they were very friendly toward each other. And there's this picture painting that was done where Franklin is kissing another person. It doesn't look like it's Mrs. Stevenson. It looks like it was somebody else. But he was over there 8 years with a very strong libido, so he probably engaged in some sexual activities during that time period.
Well, I don't think he was the first, or certainly the last.
He was not celibate. I don't think he was celibate.
Yeah, he's certainly not the first or the last American to enjoy himself in London. Finally, Mark, you brought up the current American president. I'm not going to give his name. Everyone knows who he is. I wonder whether Franklin, as a conservative, as a non-ideological conservative, would have been particularly offended by the current American president. It seems as if those types of conservatives, we've had many of them on the show, like Jonathan Rauch, Pete Wehner, David Brooks, they have the best moral critique. Do you think that Do you think that Franklin would have been particularly offended by Trump?
I think it's a mixed bag because Franklin or Mr. Trump is returning to some cultural conservative values regarding uh, the what's taught in schools, the transgender issue, the wokeness, and so forth. I don't think Franklin would be sympathetic, frankly, to that. I really don't. But he
He
doesn't
wouldn't have
like.
wanted to ban wokeness. He might not have agreed with it.
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, he was liberal in that respect, but he also, I mean, it's really hard to say because a lot of these issues that we're talking about simply didn't exist. I mean, there's nothing in Franklin's, he says nothing about homosexuality, just as an example. And so we don't really know where he stood on that. He was a ladies' man, and there's no evidence of him saying anything on some of these type of topics that are relevant to today. But we do know that he hated excessive power. At one point, he said, we don't want to have one president. We should have 12 presidents. He actually proposed that at one point to disperse power. He was very much opposed to money and power. He actually didn't want senators and congressmen and the president paid anything, that they should just volunteer their time. Well, if you do that, you only can become billionaires. So that's a criticism I would have of Franklin's views in that respect. But he did warn America that there might come a time when a king will rule over us, returning to monarchy, and he was very much opposed to that. So I think he would be totally opposed to all these executive orders that the president's engaged in. I mean, that's just contrary to everything Franklin stood for.
Well, finally, Mark, if he was indeed, as you argue in the book, half seriously perhaps, the greatest American, who's the next greatest? Who has continued this Franklin, if so to speak, Franklin-esque view of the world? What post-Benjamin Franklin American is continuing this tradition of openness and toleration and innovation and public service, all the things that I tend to agree with you are so admirable about the American character?
So when I was, I actually have fun with people. I say, I've written a new book called The Greatest American, History's Most Versatile Genius. So who do you think that is? So we've had people say George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. Edison would be an example. Certainly.
Not John Adams, I hope.
I don't think John Adams, but it's the subtitle that makes Benjamin Franklin unique, the world's most versatile genius, which again is not me that's saying it. It's another historian. And Jefferson would certainly fit into that category because he had a lot of interest. So people who have a liberal arts education and then is not, you're asking for someone to be a jack of all trades and a master of all, not just a few. And how many people fit into that category? I mean, Edison was a great scientist and inventor and so forth, and he dabbled in politics and things like that, but he never had the diverse activity that Franklin had. So that's what makes Franklin unique. He's kind of a Leonardo da Vinci, if you will. Somebody said, well, it's Leonardo da Vinci. And I said, well, he's got to be an American, not an Italian. But it has to be somebody who has all these diverse interests.
Well, he wasn't a painter, though. I mean, he did many things, but he didn't paint.
Right, but he had his own musical instrument, harmonica, that he developed. So, I mean, he was into the arts to some extent. I came up with 22 potential careers that Franklin had. 22. I think he has the Guinness Book of World Record of most careers.
Yeah, I mean, Carnegie maybe comes to mind. I mean, you think of Henry Ford and his distasteful politics, he would be excluded. I wonder whether we could compare him to Bob Dylan. You probably might be slightly outraged by that, but Dylan, master musician, writer, polemicist of one kind or another, another versatile genius.
Yeah, maybe he was a businessman too. I don't know.
He certainly was a businessman. He just sold his songs for, I think, $500 million. So,
well, my wife Joanne teaches a poetry class, and since he won the Nobel Prize in Literature, Bob Dylan is a big part of her class, and the students love it. So he does have a diverse career, that's for sure.
Well, Mark Skousen, the author of The Greatest American, I think you're in the family, eighth generation Franklin or sixth generation Franklin. The book is it's out later this month, but people can order it, Mark, from your website. They can also get it off Amazon, of course. But how would they get hold of the book?
Yeah, the pub date is in later in May, and so they go to skousenbooks.com. They can get it pre-ordered. They can actually get a copy of it at a reduced price. I pay for shipping, so skousenbooks.com.
Well, there's a lot of Franklin in you as an entrepreneur. Mark Skousen, the author of The Greatest American, a book about Benjamin Franklin, the world's most versatile genius. Thank you so much. Best of luck with the book. And best of luck with your Freedom Fest. It sounds like an interesting event down in Southern California later this month. Oh, no, middle June 11th to 14th. So we'll get you back on the show, Mark, at some point to talk about Freedom Fest and all the things you're doing down there. Thank you so much.